Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Lyn Melnick in support of I've Had to Think Up a Way to Survive on Trauma, Persistence, and Dolly Parton in conversation this evening with Hanif Abdurraqib. Just a quick webinar overview for you attendees. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open for links to purchase books that I'll be submitting there throughout the event. Q&A is available to you, however, if you're watching live, please feel free to submit your questions at any time. I'll read a selection of your questions at the conclusion of Lynn and Hanif's conversation this evening. Live transcription is also available to you as well on your toolbar. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. You can also find a little typewriter icon in the corner of your screen where you can subscribe to our channel and be kept up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events, which will continue through 2023 when they become live. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, of course, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. But most of all, we would just like to thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon or much later this evening, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our interlocutor. Lyn Melnick is the author of 3 books of poetry and a contributor to Not That Bad, Dispatches from Rape Culture. Her poems have appeared in The New Republic, The New Yorker, and the Paris Review. Her essays have appeared in Jewish Currents, LA Review of Books, and Poetry Daily. Speaking with her after she reads, Hanif Abdurraqib is a poet, essayist, and cultural critic from Columbus, Ohio. His poetry has been published in Pen American, Muzzle, Vinyl, and other journals, and his essays and criticism have been published in The New Yorker, Pitchfork, The New York Times, and Fader. He's the author of many widely acclaimed and award-winning books, including the poetry collection, The Crown Ain't Worth Much, a collection of essays, They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us, and Go Ahead in the Rain, Notes to a Tribe Called Quest. He's a graduate of Beechcroft High School. In 2021, he was named a MacArthur Fellow. Please join me in welcoming Lyn Melnick and Hanif Abdurraqib into your living rooms. And Lynn, please feel free to begin with a reading from your book.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you, Literary Books, and thank you very much, Hanif, for being here with me, and for all you've done, really, to make this book possible. I'm going to just read a little bit from the introduction, the first chapter. Excuse my voice, which I'm slowly losing over the course of book promo. So I will begin at the beginning, just a trigger warning for the mention of rape. And I'll begin. The first time I remember hearing a Dolly Parton song start to finish was in the triage room of a hospital as I waited to be admitted to drug rehabilitation program in West Los Angeles. I was 14. It was 1988, and Dolly and Kenny Rogers were singing 1983's Islands in the Stream across LA's Coast FM. I knew her voice, of course. It would have to have been hard to be anywhere near a radio or television in the last 50 years without getting to know Dolly's warm clarion soprano. But while I grew up on folk songs, basically country for blue states, music like Dolly's was often scorned in my parents' home and by my friends. My friends and I spent our time chasing down heavy metal bands on the Sunset Strip and would not have given Dolly the time of day. Many people of my generation, or at least those born outside the reign of country radio, first knew of Dolly as a straight-talking goofball on The Tonight Show, a set of giant tits, someone your grandma got a kick out of, someone who, my father would say with derision, was famous for being famous. Meanwhile, Dolly had been churning out hits for decades, possessed of a preternatural talent for writing and for singing authentic emotion into every song. Class and gender stereotypes could not and would not obscure her absolute genius or stop her from going where she wanted to go. I don't remember my parents in the moment they signed me into rehab, not their probably weary faces, younger than my own now, or much of what they said, only that the high cost of hospitalization was mentioned and a joke made about hitting the annual insurance deductible in one night. March 3rd, a date I have marked every year in the 30-plus years since. As a parent of a teenager myself now, I assume there was significant pain involved, some bewilderment, but also perhaps some acknowledgement of this predictable next step in the falling apart sequence I'd been slowly enacting since I was raped by a teenage boy on overgrown 1970s carpeting before I'd turned 10 years old. Now halfway through ninth grade, I had already been expelled from school twice. Reckless behavior, followed by variously successful attempts to cover it up, was how I spent my free time, while other kids studied or kissed or participated in team sports. I welcomed the stay at Glen Recovery Center. If I couldn't just be given an entirely new self, at least I wanted to make it clear to the world that the one I inhabited was wrecked. Being in rehab seemed like a rubber stamp to that effect. Less fond of cocaine and whiskey than of the exhilaration of forgetting, I craved the fresh environment. My parents filled out intake forms, and I was asked to create a list of people I approved to visit me. I sat with the lined sheet of paper on my lap, even though I knew I didn't want to see anyone. Outside on Pico Boulevard, the Santa Ana winds blew through the tops of the palm trees visible from the windows of the triage room. I could hear the traffic flow east toward the tall, vacant buildings of downtown after dark and west toward 20th Century Fox Studios and eventually the Pacific Ocean. It was a relief to abandon whatever promise I'd held as a curious, shy girl in my brother's hand-me-down Sears dungarees and a cherished strawberry shortcake turtleneck shirt, the outfit I'd worn to school on picture day a couple months before my body was violated on that deep pile of beige shag carpet. I'd worked hard since then to convince the outside world to join me in giving up on my potential. But Dolly's voice from the hospital's ceiling speakers held a different kind of promise than that which I'd failed to meet. It was a release, a renewal, euphoric. When I heard Dolly's voice over the 4+ minutes of Islands in the Stream, I knew I needed to hear it again. Though it would be a few months before I purchased a greatest hits cassette tape from the bargain bin at a Thrifty's Drugs, the multifaceted clarity of her voice hooked me instantly. I needed to feel that euphoria in my body again. I needed to believe in that bright precision and an artistry as unstoppable as Dolly herself. Resilience, longevity, outlast those who would doubt you, just keep going. In my darkest moments, that's been the light she's shone on me. With over 100 singles, 50 albums, 160 million records sold, more than 400 television appearances, and scores of awards, Dolly has become even more of an icon in recent years, claimed and reclaimed by fans across a startling number of demographics, and featured prominently and with due reverence everywhere, from memes and kitsch merchandise to awards shows and a Ken Burns PBS series. Dolly is an icon of feminine strength, and yet also an objectified caricature of womanhood. She's super savvy while often playing the rattlebrain. A deflection, perhaps, a feint of self-protection in a world where big talent and business acumen prove threatening when coming from a woman. She's a phenomenally accomplished artist who giggles it off as she keeps marching forward in 5-inch heels through the life she wants. She's an American dream. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you for that, Lynn. It was beautiful to hear your reading of it. I mean, of course, I've spent a lot of time with this book and have a lot of affection for it. So thank you for reading it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I'm most, the question that I get asked a lot that I think a lot of people who joyfully obsess over a single artist or a single song or album is about why. But I think a more honed in version of that question for me is, when did this kind of path begin for you, and when did you realize it was something that you could kind of massage into something fuller than just an obsession that lived within the self?
You mean, when did it seem like it was something that I could write about, or
yeah, like not even write a book about, but just like conquer. I think there are things I feel so strongly about and so exuberantly about that I don't even know if I can commit them to the page. So yeah, I mean, not even like write a book, but just kind of like write anything.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's a really good way of putting it too. Like I knew, I mean, I always had this feeling for her, but it really didn't occur to me to write about her because it seemed almost impossible, you know, like to do justice to this person that it was just my person and that I idolized. And it all came about, you know, rather sort of unintentionally in that in 2018, at the end of 2018, I had just been promoting a poetry book called Landscape with Sex and Violence. And it was all about rape culture and my trauma history. And I was just so, I had done so much touring for that book that I was just completely depleted and of talking about this, you know, my trauma and all these hard subjects. And I just wanted to write about joy. And and then I tweeted like, what if I spend all of 2019 writing about Dolly Parton? And people were like, yeah, go for it. And it never actually occurred to me that I could spend all of 2019 writing about Dolly Parton. It was just like one of those things that like, wow, wouldn't that be nice if I could actually do it? Not thinking I could actually do it. And then somehow, you know, the people of Twitter sort of encouraged me to actually think of it as something I really could do. And that's really when I thought, wait, I actually could do this. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I suddenly realized I could do it. I thought I knew everything there was to know about Dolly Parton because I'd been such an obsessive, but there was buckets more to learn about Dolly Parton.
Yeah, how did that kind of reveal itself to you, both literally and emotionally? That part of thought I knew everything, but there's so much more to know. Did that there's been points in my process of writing and research where I realized that that's the case for me, and I end up getting somewhat overwhelmed by that. Um,
Yes.
but then it's like a quick detour to excitement, like excitement of realizing that there's so much that I'm still trying to mine for that I have not touched yet. So how did that manifest itself for you? Was that kind of exhausting or exciting or?
It was both. And it was that feeling of like, whenever there'd be this whole new like wing of things I had to look into, I'd be like, oh, how am I going to take in more Dolly information? And then it would be fun usually. Um, I don't know if this was lucky, but the timing of this was that I signed the contract to write the book um, in winter of 2020. So most of the first draft of all of the first draft of the book and much of the second draft were written during lockdown. So I was sort of stuck in place anyway. So it was almost easier just to like super focus on Dolly. And I just, there's so much. I mean, she, you know, recorded her first song in 1959, and
Right.
she's been giving interviews and publications since the 60s, and so there's just so much to read, and it was a pleasure to read. Some of the interviews and TV appearances in the later 80s and 90s just become very, very canned. She's more guarded in those years. So it was a lot of watching the same stories over and over again, but
Right,
still
right.
so interesting. And I was at the time, because it was COVID, my younger daughter was going to fifth grade on Zoom, like in the same room as me. And she would hear me listening to these interviews. She's like, didn't you just say that? I was like, yeah, she gives a lot of the same answers to the same interview and to different interviews. But she, you know, so there was a lot to do, but it was, I don't know, it was so magnificent to find something that was then different. You know, I'd watch like 10 interviews on, you know, Tonight Show and talk shows, and they'd all be the same. And then you'd hear one where she just felt unguarded, and you feel like you get a glimpse into the real Dolly, and that always made it worth it.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. I mean, if you chart, I think particularly women artists through long careers, that sometimes happens, I think, where either they become more guarded or they become less guarded, and then they're kind of punished for that, like
Yes.
punished for being less guarded and more, um, I mean, the list is long, but I often think about like how, and I know this is like pulling off the shelf that's right in front of our eyes, but the way that Britney Spears was treated,
Mm,
in the 2000s, I mean, now too, but in the 2000s, where, um, and how easy it was to indoctrinate oneself into this idea of like, this woman is behaving like horribly irrationally. When if you look at just what was happening, it like wasn't even that extreme.
right.
Uh, or like that alarming.
Right. It's like whatever all of us were doing in our 20s, but nobody was following us around.
Yeah, no one was just like harassing us with cameras. So
Yeah.
do you think there's a lesson perhaps, and I know that you in this book you do such monumental work of weaving in your own life with your relationship to Dolly's life. In doing that, were there kind of parallel lessons that you found in terms of growing up and growing towards a protective, building a protective shell around oneself?
That's a good question. I almost feel like it's opposite. I feel like as I've grown, I mean, I certainly always felt like I wanted to protect my own secrets for my sake and the sake of others, but the older I get, the more I want to not be so secretive. I don't want to hold all this stuff in. Um, and I think with Dolly, as she had in the early 80s, she was getting all these death threats. I mean, it was like at a time where you could like look up where she lived in the phone book. It's just this would not happen today, but people were showing up at her house, and and she felt like she was everywhere and overexposed, and she had done some movies, and she was just overwhelmed. And I think she just couldn't handle it. It was too much exposure, and this was before like paparazzi and all this stuff. And that's when she clammed up. But the interesting thing to me, which maybe is a parallel, is that I think like post-pandemic Dolly has like zero fucks left to give. Like she just stopped like trying to appeal to everybody and play all sides, and like she's just sort of like, she's 76. She hates being trapped at home, and she was trapped at home for a year. Like I think she's just in this new period where she's kind of like, you know what, I'm just gonna do what I want to do and say what I want to say. And so in that, I think we're in a similar moment.
Yeah, yeah. I did want to ask about the kind of interpersonal weaving of a story, and what if anything was revelatory to you in that process. I feel like um, when I find myself doing that, it's not so much that I'm trying to map my life onto the life of a musician I love, but it is always surprising when these kind of parallels emerge through affection. I think if you spend a lot of time with a musician, if you have a lot of affection for a musician, sometimes these parallels just kind of happen. They just exist, right? And yeah, I part of this is a process question, perhaps, of did you know how much of yourself you wanted to put in the book when you sat down to write it, or through the writing of it, were there kind of these light bulb moments wherein you could not turn away from the ability to put yourself in the book was maybe defined by the process?
Yeah, I mean, when I started, I'd had this, when I first started, I had no idea what I was doing. And I was just, I'd mostly written poetry before, and I was sort of approached it like poetry. Um, so, I would write about something about her, and then I'd sort of go off on this tangent about something completely unrelated to anything because I was writing like poem, and then come back to me. And, one of my editors, Jess Hopper, was like, you need to either stay with your story and like let us marinate it in a bit, or just take it out and just do straight Dolly. And then at the same time, Casey, my other editor, was like, you need to have more music in the book. And I'm like, okay. So being the sort of like nerdy, organized person that I am, I was like, okay, I'm going to do like every chapter is going to have 1/3 Dolly songs, 1/3 Dolly as a cultural phenomenon, and then 1/3 me. And so that's how I approached it, so that I would sort of be somewhat even, just because that's how my brain functions best. When I have some pattern, the chapters are different. Some do more me and less Dolly, but that's where I started with the first draft. And then I found that because I'd written poetry, and you might find this too, like I'm so used to making connections between things that may not be logically connected or easily connected. It just seems like that's the fun of it. And so I was able to bring that to prose, right? I was able to say, like, let me see how I'm going to get from this experience Dolly had to me. Because sometimes it was like a straight shot, and sometimes it was like, okay, we need to go around the corner a little bit. So that part of the process felt like writing poems.
Were those measurements the kind of one, because I feel like it's just so seamless throughout the book. And so how would you, maybe I'm asking this for my own process and my own, but how would you kind of quantify those measurements? Like, I mean, obviously it was like, were the 1/3 like rough estimates, or did you get a feel for when you were overdoing one and neglecting the other? And how did you get to a point where you could kind of fold those into each other really easily?
I think, I mean, the first, 3, 4 chapters, I was very measured because also I had never done anything like this before, and yet I'd signed this contract to do it, and I was like, guess I have to do this, and it was very unnerving because I had never written about music before. I had never written a book length prose thing before, and I had never written memoir. So I was very intimidated. So having those numbers in place was like my safety net. Like, oh, I'm doing everything my editors asked, and I'm like, they can't fault me for this. I think, and then, that was the first draft. Then as I went on with the chapters, I just got more comfortable with my ability to write about music, and I felt like more of an authority, because that took a little while for me because I hadn't written about music before. I was a fan, and I'm not a music critic, and I just didn't know if I was doing it justice. But once I got more comfortable with that, I was able to sort of just just on instinct know what the balance was. Like I knew what it was approximately, but I was no longer counting uh, chapter space as I wrote it. I just knew that it was the right balance. But I'm happy to hear that it sounds seamless because it really wasn't at first.
Yeah. No, I mean, it never is, right? Like the process does not
So
often doesn't reflect the end result.
right.
Upon the passing of Loretta Lynn,
Mm,
I've begun to kind of like think about particularly the legacies of women in country music.
mm,
Um, because I love Loretta Lynn so much. I'm a big Emmylou Harris fan. I love Dolly Parton and so on and so on. And there's a way I find this with when I was working on Little Devil in America, I found this with Black women and Black blues women specifically. There's a way that these legacies are tied to tragedy or hard living or what men have done.
right.
Um, some of that, it feels like there are some women who've maybe wrestled control from that, like Loretta Lynn, like writing songs that are very tongue in cheek or sometimes not about men, right? Um, but it, when confronting a book like this, or when confronting a subject like this, who is dropped into a genre like that,
Right.
did you find that like teasing out the legacy so that it becomes something very real and touchable and not necessarily tied to uh, grief, and particularly not tied to what has been done to a person?
Right.
Um, were you what were some things that you were thinking about in terms of like staying in a place where you're being honest about history, but also not letting history overwhelm the person's full self?
Yeah, I mean, and it's difficult. I mean, Dolly is very much of her time, right? Like she was born in 1946 in East Tennessee, and that's the schooling she had. These are the people she knew, and that was her world for a very long time, for until she went to Nashville after she graduated, and so she is very much of her time. And I also like in writing it, I wanted in thinking about her legacy. Um, I I sort of always go back to her songwriting because she um her songs are so are often, not always, often so deeply feminist, but she wouldn't claim that title until very recently. And her songs just sort of told the stories, as she would say, of the people that she knew in her town and what they were going through. I mean, most most girls when they were graduating from high school, at her high school, were just planning, they wanted to get married and have children. That was their career goal. She wanted to write songs, and she wanted to write songs about them. She wanted to write songs about what was happening in her part of the world, and to women in her part of the world. There's so many unwed mother stories in her songs. It's like almost a whole genre. There's a lot of, men who did me wrong songs, and there's a lot of songs that are, like Just Because I'm a Woman, which is her song about, double standards for, sort of sexual activity, like where, men are heroes and women are shamed. And she wrote a whole song about it.
Yeah.
And she did that in what year was that? 1968, I
Yeah.
think. And a lot of her songs wouldn't get played on the radio. Like they didn't want to play Down from Dover because that was an unwed mother. So they didn't want to play Bargain Store because they thought maybe that was about a prostitute. It was just like, so I think that like the legacy of Dolly is sort of twofold. So it's like what is happening in her songs and how her songs empowered those who listened. Um, and then there's the legacy of Dolly, who's more of this cultural icon. Um, and it's interesting because having written this book as she's almost peaking as a cultural icon, and I did not expect that.
Right.
It's been interesting to watch, and I would say that her legacy is probably tied to her philanthropy now more than anything else, which is obviously a tremendous legacy to leave. But I always end up feeling like we're not recognizing her as the just absolutely brilliant, once in a generation kind of songwriter in ways that we recognize, say, Bob Dylan or Joni Mitchell or others like that. And I feel like it has to be tied to both her background and her presentation of self, probably.
I'm excited that you brought that up. So I want to touch on that because it does seem like we're in an era where Dolly Parton is more of a like broad capital I icon
Yeah.
than a person who's had sometimes I think musicians, and again, I do think this happens to women more often than not, they are placed in this category of icon or diva, not in a pejorative way, diva in a way that, like VH1 divas, where they've achieved this status, but everything that allowed them to achieve that status somehow gets obscured.
Mm-hmm.
I see it actually beginning to happen with Mariah Carey.
I was just going to say that.
Where it feels like in a few years we will have effectively cleansed our minds of the music career she had, and now she's just like the iconic Christmas lady.
That's right.
And I don't know, with Dolly, it feels like it's especially kind of strange because she's so multifaceted and talented. So we're not just kind of forgetting about her arc as a musician, but also the film work that she's done and these things. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, not that you have to have a definitive answer on this, but do you have any thoughts or feelings on why this happens, and how to kind of keep a person's legacy at least somewhat imbued with what allowed for the legacy to happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I thought of Mariah Carey immediately too, because she's also a phenomenal songwriter,
Yeah.
and is always overlooked for that because she's overshadowed by the other stuff, including her vocal talent, which but also just the tabloid stuff about her and her look and all of that, and similarly, I think what has happened with her and is what happens with Dolly, and I think with a lot of women musicians, is they have their moment where they're the young new thing and they're sexy and they get objectified and they're fiercely talented and their fans appreciate them, but the larger culture just thinks of them as this sort of very attractive woman who sings. And I think then as they get older, so when they get to middle age, and that's really when Dolly's career kind of dipped, is when she got to her 50s. And that's when she decided to go back to her roots, and she released her first bluegrass album, and then she released two more, I think all in her 50s, because she was like, country radio's not playing me anymore. She's not doing pop music. She's just going to do what she loves. And then she did, and she was just like full on a musician, and she wasn't this she was sort of like a legacy person. You'd think of her when you thought of like movies from the 80s and things like that, but she wasn't the icon she is now. And then I think women get to an age where it's safe to be excited about them again because they've lasted so long. So they pass through these like middle-aged years where like they're not interesting to people, and then they become interesting again because they've lasted so long. and they're just like a little bit cute and warm and fuzzy. And I think, this is, I'm sure, like reductive in many ways, but this is how I perceived Dolly's trajectory, and I've seen it happen with other artists as they become more popular, as they're like safer to like again because they're in their 70s. And I think with Dolly, she's always just been herself. Like there's no real change in Dolly, and that's, I think, something that has made her an icon at this point. Like what she's always been is who she is now, and she's always had the same sort of convictions and religious beliefs and love of music and just astonishing talent. And she just is. She never stops. Like she apparently gets up at 3 a.m. every morning because that's her best working time. And she works in the quiet and, is writing songs. And she's written like 3,000 songs. And, she's just always, always working. Almost like despite whatever like phase of her audience's appreciation for her she's in, she's just going to do the work. And so maybe she's being rewarded for that a little bit. I also think this convergence of the pandemic with, 70s Dolly is just sort of, who could have predicted that she would like fund the vaccine and then she would sort of go on to be an icon for that. I think maybe shifted this a little bit, but through it all, people will remember her, publicly as, she was in 9 to 5 and it was such a feminist movie, or they'll remember, some of her better known songs, Islands in the Stream, but they very rarely talk about her songwriting. And that's, I think, I can't obviously prove this, but I think it has something to do with her being a woman, and a woman who has been just unabashedly feminine her entire life.
Yeah, and I think that projects us onto like the way she's perceived now with this kind of like America's grandmother thing, which is sweet in some ways, but I think in some ways, like I there's a lens on that feels nefarious to me.
Oh yeah.
And just like really reductive.
Absolutely. I think like it's like women can be sexy when they're that age, and then we don't want to remember them, and then they get to the cute phase, and then it's like it's safe again to like them. We don't want to like them when they're in that like past their prime stage, but once they're cute and older, then it's it's safer somehow. It does seem nefarious.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, so my favorite Dolly era, and I pulled it up just to be sure. So my favorite, because Dolly also has like a lot of albums, like a lot of albums. There were years where she was putting out 4 albums. Like 71, she had like 4 or 5.
I know. The output in the early 70s and late 60s is tremendous. I don't know how she was doing it.
And what a year for 71, because like Coat Many Colors is the last of that. That's I think canonically that is what received as the Great Dolly album. Mm-hmm. But I love from about 77 to 87. And I really love those records. Like even if I were to extract the trio record, which I adore that one, but even if I were to say, okay, just take that one out, I still love like New Harvest First Gathering is the one that kind of starts that run for me. And Dolly, Dolly, Dolly is so good, and The Great Pretender is so good. And there was a stretch where she was kind of in that era, finding both mixed critical reception and mixed commercial reception, at least until 9 to 5 happened, I feel like.
Yeah.
Because you're so immersed in this, and because her discography is so expansive, I was going to ask if you had a favorite era. It doesn't have to be a favorite album, but maybe a favorite run of album making.
That's so hard. There are so many good ones. I mean, she's like extremely strong. I think late 70s Dolly is great. Early 70s Dolly is great. I think I'll just name all the eras and say they're great. I think probably my favorite is the Bluegrass album era, which was 1999 to I think 2002. So it was sort of a short era, but it was those 3 albums that really sort of sent me over the edge as a Dolly obsessive, because I've been following her all the way. And I in writing this book, I listened to her entire discography from start to finish twice, which took a long time. And again, my daughter Stella had to listen to it too. And it's remarkable. I mean, and including the stuff with Porter, all
Yeah.
the albums she did with Porter Wagner. It's a lot of albums, and I think of all of the eras, the bluegrass is her most consistent. You know, there's like sometimes it gets a little patchy in places, and also because she was putting out so many albums. And some of her, you know, uh, 90s albums did what the 90s did to everybody. And so, like, they're not terrific.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not like the whole album isn't terrific. There'll be a couple songs on there, you know. But yeah, I think I would say probably it's the bluegrass albums. And one thing that Dolly does that I love is that she'll put the same song on different albums. And she does a lot of that in her bluegrass album. She'll pull songs that didn't really hit on her earlier album. She'll put them on her bluegrass album, which I love that, like just thinking about that as a poet. Like if we could just like a poem that didn't take off, we could just stick it in the next book.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Or if there's
Right?
just slight reworkings, like a lot of artists do with traditional
Yeah.
songs.
Exactly.
The Dolly album that from the '90s that really stands out to me, and I don't love it, but the album cover is so like '90s, and is the Honky Tonk Angels record.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. With the
And
hair. Yeah.
it looks like it just looks like a church brochure, you know. And I mean that album is it's fine. I think one might come to it. I don't know how you feel about it, but I think like coming to that album and having an album with Dolly and Tammy and Loretta, I'm like, this has to be, if it's not perfect, because these are like three perfect artists. But
Yes.
that's one of those albums of hers where I think the good moments are just like so singularly good.
Yes.
Like Silver Threads and Golden Needles is just,
That's so good.
and so I guess now are you listening to that? Like, did you listen to Run Rose Run earlier this year?
I
And did
did.
you enjoy it?
Yeah, I did.
I like it a lot.
It's it's one of those albums that is uneven to me. Like I feel like I read the book too, so I was kind
Yeah.
of listening to it, which the album is better than the book. I don't know if you read the book, but and it was so clear to me that Dolly didn't really write it because Dolly's such a good writer. She's a
She's very good.
phenomenal writer.
Yeah.
So I think my reading of the book clouded my feeling about the album a little bit, but I felt there were some stuff that I thought was great. I kind of wish she'd had a little more time on it, spent a little bit more time on it.
Yeah, it felt like, so I didn't finish the book, with all respect to James Patterson.
That's
Again, I mean,
right.
who cares? I don't know. Whatever. He'll be fine. My respect. But it did seem like the album was made like in response to an existing, it was kind of like,
Right.
this book is out, we need the album. It was
Yeah.
like very much in response to, and even with that, there were moments on there that I thought were really spectacular.
Right.
And so I'm mostly with this kind of, even outside of the realm of Dolly, with this kind of close listening and this kind of like joyfully obsessive listening, have you felt yourself like hearing the world differently, music wise? Like, do you find yourself now, like I remember when I came out of writing Go Ahead and Rain and kind of delving into just boxes and boxes of samples from rap songs, it altered the way that I heard all music, coming out of that book. And I'm wondering if you've reaped any benefits of that process of hearing things differently.
Yeah, that's a great question. I had never listened to music so closely before. I mean, I've always just been like, music is just my favorite art form. I've always been obsessed with music and needed music, but I never really thought about it so hard before. And so I think I have that now, like where I'm like, oh, they did this in the song, or like just the construction of the song seems to stick out to me a lot. When I was done writing the book, I had to put aside Dolly music for a while because I was just oversaturated, and I found myself just listening to just all pop hits from the 90s. That's like all I wanted to listen to was just, like really bubblegum kind of like bop kind of stuff for like a solid month just to get my head in some other place. But of course, then I just sort of still go back to Dolly. The way that I listen to music most of the time is that I get very, very obsessed with listening to a song or an album, and I listen to it until my kids want to kick me out, and like it's kind of absurd how much I can listen to one song and sometimes one album over and over again. Um, and I don't think that like that changed following the book, but I do think that my thinking of how musicians work definitely changed, and it became
Right.
so interesting to me to see how and just to appreciate how they construct their songs in a way that I didn't appreciate. I appreciated it like in my heart, but not so much in my head. And I think I got that from writing this book.
I mean, I guess the last big thing I had was about poems. And um, one, did you find yourself while writing this book weaving into and out of poem making too, or was it like I'm writing this book and this is it, this is all I can focus on?
Um, the latter, really. Just started the book when I was finishing my last book of poems, Refuse Nick, so I had to do a little bit of editing on that book while I had first started writing this book. And since then, I haven't really written poems. I'm not sure why, and I'm kind of terrified to go back to it. I don't know if you feel this. Like, am I ever
Yeah,
going to be able to do this again? Because I think in sentences now. Like, I can't like lines. And I teach poetry, right? So I know how to teach it and think about it, but I just haven't gone back. And um, I think I had to be all consumed with this project while I was writing it in order to really to get it done in the time frame that I had and to not cloud my I didn't want to get too back to that sort of early kind of fanciful chapter writing where I was just, kind of still having poem head. I just wanted to sort of delve into prose writing. But I did think excuse me, one of the things that I realized in writing the book was how much of a poet Dolly is,
right.
and just like in dissecting her song, her lyrics, like she's got these internal rhymes and she's got like the rhythm of her lyrics, even like divorced from the music. If you just look at the lyrics, are so tight and so well done. I mean, she's such a poet, and I feel like I am so glad that I could bring that to my book and maybe just get people to think of her like that a little bit, and
Yeah.
recognize that genius.
That was what I wanted to ask about poems, because in the book you do a good job of like close reading language, her language. And you kind of answered the second question because it was going to be about if you return to poems with any
Mm.
kind of renewed excitement. Because I think sometimes like doing those close readings is what invigorates me um towards,
Yeah.
building towards poems. But I also do know that coming out of a massive project, it is a little hard to
Yeah, I mean, I've never finished a book where I didn't have my next project sort of lined up. I always knew what I was doing next. Or, like when I finished my book Landscape with Sex and Violence, I knew what I was going to write Refuse Nick next. And when I was finishing Refuse Nick, well, I had started writing this memoir. And so I just always knew, and it was great to be able to have that other thing while you're promoting a book and feel like
yeah.
this isn't the end of things, but this is the first time that I don't know what's next. I'm taking all suggestions anyone has. If anyone has any ideas for me, I just don't know. I don't know if it's going to be poetry. I don't know if it's going to be prose. I just have no idea. So it's kind of a scary place to be, but maybe an exciting place to be. I keep telling myself maybe it's exciting. I don't know.
I personally will be excited for whatever comes next. Lynn, thank you so much for chatting with me. I love this book, and I really loved particularly how committed you were to the process of um, rendering Dolly fully as an artist, particularly the portions where you really dive deep into her as a writer. That's the kind of thing that really got my brain working and just got me to a point of appreciation as someone who loves her writing. So thank you so much. I think you did really immense work with this
Thank
book.
you. Thank you so much. That means so much to me.
All right, I'm gonna let John hop back on and do the audience questions and yeah, thank you again, Lynn.
Thank you.
There's no questions at the moment. This is just a reminder for you viewing at home. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A. We have a few minutes to answer any questions you have. But maybe in the interim, if there's any last questions you wanted to ask Lynn, any sort of maybe final thing we didn't get to, please feel free and or if there's just maybe a last question, and if someone comes in with a N+1 last question, I'll pop on and ask that for Lynn tonight.
Yeah, I mean, I guess only one last question from me, and it is if people ask me this a lot when I write about musicians, but do you have any, like, do you care at all if Dolly reads the book, or is it not important to you?
It's funny that I think that the question, not that one, but the question I get the most from people is, will you get to meet Dolly? And the answer is no. and would you want to meet Dolly? And so yours is sort of like maybe a more possible question. Like the way I feel about meeting Dolly is that, like, I of course wouldn't say no, but the idea fills me with such terror that, like, I don't know that I could handle it. And then also I feel like we're best friends already. She just doesn't know it yet. So that I think would be weird. I know that the book was sent to her by my audiobook publisher, and I had to write her a note. They said, why don't you, like, handwrite a note for her, which was like the scariest thing I've ever done. Like, let me distill everything that I feel about Dolly into this. And I had to, like, use a pink pen because I wanted to, like, be in the spirit of Dolly, and, you know, pretty stationary. And so I wrote her a little note that went with the book. I would love for her to read it, because I hope she would see that, like, how much she's appreciated as an artist in particular, and how much she has helped me in my personal life, and that I'm one of like a gazillion other people who could write their own book about how she has gotten them through. And I hope that she can feel that, because to me, that's, she has all this philanthropy, but to me, that's like the biggest gift that you can give someone, is that your art can, sort of keep people going. And so hopefully she could see that, but I don't, I'm not, like, holding my breath for that.
Yeah, I'm rooting for you. I'm rooting for that.
Thank you, honey.
We just have one question from the audience. I think this can be our last questions of the evening. Mary writes, I've just started reading your book. What was your favorite chapter, and what was the hardest chapter to write?
That's a very good question. I'm trying to think. My favorite chapter to write was probably the last one, because it was the one where I got to catalog everything that Dolly is. So, and it's got that sort of happy ending feel to it. And I did also really love to write the Here You Come Again chapter, which was about a lot about my relationship with my husband, Timothy. The hardest chapters to write, there's two. One is the bargain store chapter, because there's a lot of violence in that chapter. And what's strange about that is also one of my favorites to write, because writing the music part of that chapter was absolutely exhilarating. It's really fun. So that was, like, both sides. The hardest stuff for me to write in the book was about my daughter. Whenever I had to write or both of my daughters, really, like, whenever I had to write anything about them, I basically cried through the whole thing. It's just it's a very strange feeling to sort of articulate your own feelings about your children in real time. Most of what I write about in the book is history, my own history, and that was like happening as I wrote it. And so those are my hardest chapters to write, I think. Thank you for that question.
Thank you Thank you for that answer, and thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, we've reached the top of the hour here at Home with Literati, but Lyn Melnick, Hanif Abdurraqib, thank you so much for joining us. You can purchase I've Had to Think Up a Way to Survive from Literati Bookstore. There's links in the chat. There's links in the description below if you're watching us later on YouTube. Lynn, Hanif, hope to have you both in the store in the not too distant future, but until then, continue to be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Have a great night all. Take care.
Thank you.